Grade. How did the Pope get the bird flu? He got it from a cardinal. How does the Pope dry his hands? He uses a papal towel. Oh, man. What happens when a Pope dies? Another one popes up. Okay. Great jokes. Why am I joking about papal matters? Well, because one of the topics we're going to be covering in chapter 15 is the subject of papal authority. That is the power of the Pope and how it pertains to Europe and his relationship with people like the Holy Roman Emperor and the nobles and the kings of Europe. All right, so chapter 15 is titled Medieval Conflicts and Crusades. Conflicts are mostly going to refer to conflicts within Europe itself. Sometimes it's between different kingdoms in Europe. Other times it's going to be between the Pope and a royal authority like the Holy Roman Emperor or maybe a king or a very powerful noble. Crusades are conflicts outside of Europe, conflicts between European forces, European Christian forces, and Muslim forces in places like the Holy Land in Jerusalem. So we're going to cover all of this. It covers a nearly 700-year period. We're going to start in the year 800, talking about Charlemagne, and we're going to end in 1492. Remember, 1492 is when Christopher Columbus sails to the New World, and it's usually marked as the end of what we would call medieval Europe. Like 1492 is like the last year of truly medieval Europe. Okay, so the way that I've organized these slides is different from the order that the material in the chapter is presented. So, for example, section 1 is about the conflict between the Holy Roman Emperor and Pope Leo III, Pope St. Gregory VII and the Holy Roman Emperor Otto the Great and their successors. Right, that's in section 1. Whereas look here on the first slide, I mentioned Magna Carta, which is part of section 2. Right, so things are kind of out of order, but that's okay. You're going to have read the entire chapter, so I don't think you'll have trouble keeping things straight in your head. All right, so this beginning part is some introductory material. Some of it's from section 1, some of it's from section 2, some of it is from chapter 14. Right, so we need to start with Charlemagne. So remember, Charlemagne and his Frankish empire, or his Frankish tribe, manages to unite Europe under Christendom by aligning his power with that of the Catholic Church and the Pope. Charlemagne's empire, however, only lasts for about 100 years because Charlemagne does not have a clearly appointed successor. It's kind of amazing how many times in history you'll have a really powerful ruler who fails to clearly appoint a successor. Oftentimes they don't do it until they're on their deathbeds, and then there's all sorts of like politicking and secrecy and lies and murders that happen when a ruler tries to appoint a successor while he's on his deathbed. So if you ever become like king of the world, be clear who your successor is before you get near death. Right? That's just a little piece of advice I have to you future tyrants. Okay, so Charlemagne doesn't have a clear successor, so when he dies, Europe is basically up for grabs. There's a lot of chaos, and remember, like we learned in chapter 14, this leads to the strengthening of the Catholic Church over the kingdoms of Europe and a rise of feudalism in Europe to try to provide stability. All right, now we're fast forwarding to the year 1066. In the year 1066, we have something called the Norman invasion of England. So before 1066, England was controlled by a group called the Saxons, and modern-day France was controlled by a group called the Normans. So in 1066, the Normans invade England, conquer the Saxons, and establish the English monarchy, which still exists 1,000 years later today. Right? Okay, and then we're going to fast forward again another 200 years. Remember, I'm just giving some introductory information on this chapter. We're not really going into a lot of detail. So 200 years later almost, there is a powerful group of English nobles who do not like the King of England. His name is King John. And they force him to sign a very important legal document called Magna Carta, which establishes something called the rule of law and limits the power of the king. Basically, Magna Carta establishes a tradition of English law. Now, why does this matter to us? It's because here in the United States, we follow the English common law tradition, right? Which is made concrete by this document signed in 1215 by King John called Magna Carta, right? So the reason we have like our Bill of Rights and our Constitution can be traced all the way back to King John signing Magna Carta in 1215. So this is a document that basically limits the power of the king, and it says even the king has to obey the law. It used to be the idea that law came from the king. Magna Carta says no, kingship comes from law. Law pre-exists the king. So even the king has to obey the law. How did the English nobles convince King John to do this? We'll get into that a little bit later. But basically, if you look at this picture here, you can see some clues, right? We have some church figures here. We also have nobles here who are dressed for battle. We have a king seated at a table, right? So King John is being pressured by very militarily strong nobles who seem to be united against him, and also by powerful members of the church. They are surrounding him and pressuring him to sign this document. We'll get into more of the politics behind that later. Magna Carta also creates what is going to be known as the English Parliament, which takes a lot of lawmaking power away from the king. So, for example, one of the things the English Parliament is going to do is it's going to say the king cannot create any taxes unless the Parliament says it's okay. Right? So it starts to separate power in government. It says some of the power belongs to the king, other power belongs to the church, other power belongs to nobles, like in Parliament. All right. Okay. So like I said earlier, there's a lot of chaos after the fall of Charlemagne's empire. And this is a time of tremendous growth and opportunity for the church, because when there's a power vacuum, it always gets filled. And one of the forces that fills this power vacuum is the Catholic Church. One of the reasons the church is able to fill this vacuum is because Charlemagne himself worked very closely alongside Pope Gregory the Seventh, Pope Leo, not Pope Gregory, Pope Leo III and Charlemagne work hand in hand together. So Charlemagne sees the Pope as an ally and gives him a lot of political power. Well, generations later, this is actually going to lead to some conflicts between the Pope and the leaders of Europe. So Charlemagne has a good relationship with the Pope, but not all kings and emperors do. Right? Kings and popes often struggle with one another for power. And they do this by limiting each other's power, by trying to undercut each other's power. So, for example, the most famous dispute between a king and a pope that we're going to learn about in medieval Europe is a dispute between the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV and Pope Gregory VII. And they have a dispute over who has the power to appoint church officials, like bishops. So Pope Gregory VII says only the Pope can appoint bishops. Henry IV, however, who is an emperor, says, wait a second, bishops are important political figures, if the Pope is the only person who can appoint these really important political figures, then it's going to be hard for me to surround myself with allies. Right? So Henry IV opposes the idea that only the Pope can appoint bishops. So that's one thing that they argue about. Another thing they argue about is basically who is higher, right? Or are they equal? Is the emperor higher than the Pope? Is the Pope higher than the emperor? Right? So after decades of struggling against each other, the two sides finally reach a compromise, which is called the Concordat of Worms, which is an agreement that says, okay, the Pope gets to appoint church officials like bishops, not the emperor, but the emperor can give land grants and feudal estates to the bishops. So the bishops owe the Pope spiritual obedience. The bishops have to obey the Pope, but the bishops owe the Holy Roman Emperor feudal obedience. So this is going to matter a lot in which bishops are loyal to which leaders. All right, so over the centuries, popes in Europe are going to become incredibly powerful politically. Right? And this is going to lead to the Crusades, because there's going to be a pope called Pope Urban II, who decides that he wants to use some of his political power to order the military forces of the various kingdoms of Europe to march on Jerusalem to recapture the Holy Land from Muslim forces. Right, so this is going to be the period of the Crusades. The Crusades, for the most part, are a failure. They're a big, big mess, but they have a tremendous influence on the shaping of Christendom, and it's an opportunity for Christendom to flex its muscles for the rest of the world to see. Right? Another consequence of the Crusades is it results finally in Muslims losing control of Spain. All right, we're going to stop there. We'll cover more material, introductory material to the chapter in the next video. I think this is a good foundation